A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We are continuing with our understanding of Khidr al-Islam and the controversies surrounding his tradition and his story. I would like to start with the stories and the references to Khidr al-Islam in the Jewish religion. Now, the Jewish religion that we see today is very different from the Jewish religion which was found at the time of the Prophet Musa alayhi salam. And many of the things in history, they have been lost in transmission, and many of the information is not present there. And we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found those scrolls near Dead Sea, there were many things written in the 1st century AD which are not part of the mainstream Judaism now. Now, the most important change which happened in Judaism is that in the 6th century, something known as the Rabbanic Judaism or Yahudat Rabbaniyat or Rabbanit is started. And the Yahudat Rabbanit, it believed that when Musa alayhi salam went to Allah and Allah gave him the Torah, the Pentateuch, it was in two forms. One of the knowledge that Allah gave him was in Torah, which is written down, and then Allah also gave him some knowledge which was verbal and which was transmitted verbally from one generation to another. Now, the original Jews, and some of them are still around, like the Samariyun, they call them the Samaritans, which comes from the area of Samara, like the West Bank of Palestine is known as Judea and Samara. In the area of Samara, there were some Jews. They are one of the oldest Jews, and they don't believe in this. They say that Allah's guidance came in Torah, written down, full stop. But they say no. The Rabbinic Judaism, which is now very popular, they say no. There was also something, a secret knowledge, which was more spiritual, like the Tasawwuf, which came only from the word and was never written down. However, if it was supposed to be oral transmission and never written down, they did write it down in the 6th century. And they started to make many references and stories. And one of the very famous writers of that time, or not that time, after many hundred years, was Rabbi Nissim bin Yaqub, Nissim bin Jacob. And he wrote a story. And in this story, the details are very similar to what is described in Surah Al-KAHF. And many people have objected, especially Christians and Jews, and said, oh, the story in Surah Al-KAHF of Khidr and Musa alayhi salam is actually taken from the story of Rabbi Nissim bin Yaqub. And the Prophet ﷺ changed the characters, na'udhu. In the story of Rabbi Nissim bin Yaqub, instead of Khidr alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam, there's Ilyas alayhi salam, Elijah. And there is another person with him whose name is Rabbi Joshua bin Lavi, Yusha bin Lavi. Now remember that Musa alayhi salam's student, according to Hadith, was known as Yusha bin Nun, but this is Yusha bin Lavi. And the story, I'll tell you the similarities. In the first place they go, there's no boat mentioned here, but they go to a very pious couple. And they're very nice to them, old couple, and they give them food and they give them beds and everything. And in the night, after all the good they've done to Ilyas alayhi salam and Rabbi Yusha bin Lavi, their cow dies. So Yusha bin Lavi asks Ilyas, is this what Allah gives them as a reward, such nice people, and the cow dies? You remember in Surah Al-Kahf, the young son dies of the righteous couple. But here the cow dies. So Ilyas alayhi salam tells Yusha bin Lavi that actually the angel of death came to kill the wife of the good man. And Ilyas alayhi salam talked to the angel of death and said, don't kill her if you want to take a life, because he said, I'm here to take a life, I have to take a soul. He said, take the soul of the cow. So it is a blessing from Allah. In the second part of the story, they go to a town and they knock on the door of a rich man and they ask him for food. And he's a miser and he refuses to give them any food or water, doesn't even talk to them, treats them very badly. And Ilyas alayhi salam sees that the rich man's house, it has got a wall which is about to topple. So he fixes the wall. So Rabbi Joshua bin Lavi asks him, he says, he was bad to us. Why did you fix his wall? And Ilyas al-Islam says, because under this wall is a treasure. And if it will fall down, this rich miser, he'll get all the treasure. So this is a punishment from God that I fixed it. So the story is similar to the story told in Surah KAHF, but with a twist. Interestingly, Nasim bin Yaqub was born in 990 AD and died in 1062 AD. So he has come like 300 to 400 years after the Prophet ﷺ. So all the objections go out of the window, chucked out of the door. How can the Prophet ﷺ, na'uzubillah, copy the story from the rabbinic Judaism when it was first written 300 to 400 years later? There's absolutely no record of this story being present before. So that has gone out of the window. But you would see that later on, this story somehow comes back into the story of Khidr al-Islam. And in many parts of the Muslim world, Khidr al-Islam is associated with Ilyas al-Islam, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Now, here we have to understand one thing, that most of the people who became Muslim were either Christian or Jews before. And there's a very strong influence of Judaism and Christianity into Islam, because these people, when they accepted Islam, they brought Torah and Zabur and the teachings of Torah and Zabur with them, and the Injil. And Muslims have always been very open to the Ahl Kitab. So many of these things got mixed. Even today, if you read a book called Qasasul Anbiya, it has stories which are 90% from Torah and Zabur and Injil, and only 10% from Quran. In comparison to another book known as Qasasul-Quran, which has stories purely from the Quran. Now, I'll give you a few examples of how the Jewish rabbinic tradition, the rabbinic Jewish, the mystical, spiritual Judaism affected Islam. You might have heard of a very popular saint known as Sarmad Kashani, who was born in 1590 and died in 1661. He was the spiritual leader of Dara Shikoh, the crown prince of the Mughal Empire. And Sarmad Kashani was actually an Armenian Jew who converted to Islam. But even after converting to Islam, the first thing he did was he translated the Torah into Persian with the help of his student, who was a Hindu converted to Islam, known as Abhay Chand. And for the first time, during the time of Dara Shikoh and King Shah Jahan, the information from Torah, Zabur, and even Injil was translated into Persian and available to the people. Even in modern Islam, we have a figure known as Muhammad Asad, and he's a great scholar of Islam. May Allah bless his soul. His original name was Leopold Weiss, and he has done the best translation of Quran into English I've ever known. So there are contributions from the Jews throughout the centuries who accepted Islam and became important scholars and important leaders, and even spiritual leaders and Quranic scholars over the centuries. Now, with this tradition of Judaism and Christians mixing with Islam when people became Muslim, the concept developed of Khidr al-Islam as being immortal. Because you remember, just now we talked about that in the Old Bible and the Christian Bible, Torah, Zabur, it is mentioned that there is a holy figure who's known as Melchizedek or Melchizedek, as they say in English. And he is a priest of a place called Salem. And he was even supposed to be alive at the time of Nuh al-Islam. In fact, born at the time of Nuh al-Islam. And the Jewish tradition says that he was born of a virgin, just like Isa al-Islam was born of Bibi Maryam. And during the flood of Nuh al-Islam, he was taken to heaven by Jibreel al-Islam and kept there for 40 days and then brought back. And as soon as he was born, he sat up on the bed and he started talking. And he was clothed and he was blessing the Lord. So this was a very strong figure. And even old scripts, if you see, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they describe it as being a divine being, a human being who's never died. And they give him titles, Hebrew titles like Elohim, which are usually reserved for Allah. And in the Rabbinic Judaism, he's a very important figure. So when Rabbinic Judaism traditions came to Islam and people accepted Islam from Judaism, they wanted the same kind of figure in Islam, and they found Khidr al-Islam. And it was very convenient to label him as an immortal being. The second thing which happened in areas of Turkey and some areas of Central Asia is that you'd remember that Rabbi Nasim bin Yaqub was talking about Khidr al-Islam-like character known as Yusha and Ilyas al-Islam. So here in the 13th century, a sect developed among the Muslims known as the Alawi Shias. Now, Alawi Shias are also known as Shia Imami Tasawwufi and Shia Batini, and they actually take origin from a 13th century Alawi saint known as Haji Bektash Wali. They have a very famous festival which is known as Khidr, and the Khidr festival is either celebrated on the May 5th and May 6th according to the Gregorian calendar, or April 23rd according to the Julian calendar. And I think April 23rd is very important with them, and often this is the day they celebrate it. So what is Khidr? It is a very important day of celebration among the Alawi Shia. And Khidr is actually a combination of two words. It's a combination of Al-Khidr and Ilyas. Originally it was called Rose Khizar, and now Khidr. So Khidr, Ilyas combined. And this is the day they say that both Khidr al-Islam and Ilyas al-Islam, they come together, they meet each other. Every year they meet each other and they compare notes about what they've been doing throughout the year, because both are considered to be immortal. So this is another tradition which is not found among most of our countries, but is a very strong tradition in the Turkish area. If you move on towards Europe, the Balkans, there's another role of Khidr al-Islam. Among the Balkan Muslims, the European Muslims, proper European Muslims, Khidr al-Islam is a dragon slayer. He has slayed dragons. And sometimes he slays dragons by himself, and sometimes he is slaying dragons or helping people slay dragons. Especially there is a saint which is known as Sari Saltik. And this again is Alawi Turkish Darwish, and he's very popular in the Crimea region among the Tatars, and he might have been originally a Tatar saint, and he's very popular among the Balkans. And Khidr al-Islam helps him slay the dragon, but many a times he's slaying it himself. Now, where did this come from? In this region, the patron saint was Saint George. Now, Saint George, according to Christianity, was a soldier from the region of Cappadocia, which was Greek at that time and now is in Turkey. And he was a member of the Praetorian Guard of the Roman Emperor. And he became Christian, and he refused to give up his religion, and he was martyred. And St. George is very, very popular. So popular, he is the patron saint of England, of Ethiopia, Georgia, Catalonia, Aragon in Spain. Even universities, cities all over the world, they have him as a patron saint. So he's a protector saint of many of these areas. And St. George's Day is traditionally celebrated on 23rd of April, which you would remember is now when the Alawi Muslims celebrate Khidr and Ilyas coming together. So obviously, when the Christians of these regions became Muslim, they venerated St. George before accepting Islam. They did not want to leave that character, so they incorporated Khidr into the role. And St. George, which in Christian mythology is a dragon slayer. If you see British monarch coins, on the reverse is St. George on a horse slaying a dragon. He became Khidr al-Islam, the dragon slayer. Interestingly, when the Crusades happened and the Christians came back to these areas and occupied these areas, they saw this character of Khidr al-Islam slaying dragons, and they said, well, this is much better than St. George, but we can't replace St. George. But this character is wonderful because he's spiritual, he's knowledgeable, and he has contact with Allah, and he does miracles. So we need that character. So what they did was, They took that character of Khidr al-Islam slaying the dragon and they made him into a knight known as the Green Knight. And they put him into the stories of King Arthur. So the Arthurian tale, if you read them, there are stories about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And that Green Knight character is completely Khidr al-Islam. He is very wise, he's very knowledgeable, and he is the only man to have drunk the water of life, which makes him immortal and also makes him green. And he seems to be doing evil acts which are actually noble deeds to prevent greater evils or reveal greater goods. So exactly the character of Khidr al-Islam, and it went back to Europe and became the Green Knight. So first it was borrowed from Europe and made a dragon slayer, and then went back to Europe and became the Green Knight. And there's a book by Alice Lasseter, Spain to England, a comparative study of Arabic, European and English literature of the Middle Ages, if you want any reference to it. And it's very interesting to see how the Islamic and Arabic tradition has brought back into Christianity and mixed up with the Christian tradition, just like our tradition got mixed with Christian and Judaic tradition. Next comes the immortality of Khidr al-Islam. How did Khidr al-Islam become immortal? And in every legend, in every region of the world, there were some immortal deities, immortal characters, supernatural characters. He got mixed with them. But then there's a story of Alexander Romance, about Alexander the Great seeking the fountain of immortality, Abe Hayat or Ma'al Hayat. And this story, which is known as Sikandar Nama, was written many centuries ago, and we don't know who wrote it. But this story borrowed the character of Khidr al-Islam and made him the guardian of the well of water of immortality. And as I mentioned earlier, that this confusion arises from the area of Bahrain. The island of Bahrain had a big Greek population which was settled by Alexander the Great, and the official language of the island was Greek for many time, and the people spoke Syriac and Aramaic instead of Arabic at that time. And they were very literal and educated people and good businesses, and it used to be very fertile, the island, and there were freshwater springs coming into the sea at the North Sea of Bahrain. And there was this story of immortal springs of water which are bringing life forever, and Alexander was already venerated there. And when they read the Quran and they saw this Majma al-Bahrain, they thought, yes, this is our opportunity to make Khizar our own. So in the Persian Gulf, Sikandar Nama, which is written in Persian, Khizar became a character who's at Majma al-Bahrain, and he meets Alexander because Alexander was respected in parts of the Persian Gulf. And all of the story of his immortality and the Alexander romance, they take place. So we have studied how the Christian and Judaic tradition, especially the spiritual Gnostic traditions of Christianity and Judaism, and the saints of Judaism and Christianity got mixed with Khidr al-Islam. And also we saw that the objections to Surah al-KAHF by the Christian scholars and the Jewish scholars, that the stories are borrowed from rabbinic tradition, are wrong. In fact, the Jewish rabbinic tradition copied the stories from Surah al-Kahf 300 to 400 years later and incorporated it into their stories and modified the stories a lot to their own purpose. Inshallah, in the next section, we'll talk about the final major controversies of Khidr al-Islam, which is the controversies found in Persia and the Indian subcontinent. We've covered the Europe, Turkey and Middle East so far, and now we come to Persia, Iran and the Indian subcontinent, inshallah.